The voicemail came in at 11:17 on a Tuesday morning while I was checking a bid for a hotel renovation in Richmond. The caller introduced himself as Caleb Mercer, said he was buying my grandfather's workshop, and asked me to review a consent form before Friday's closing. I listened twice because none of those words belonged together. Grandpa had been dead for 5 months. Hartley Workshop was 3 hours away, and as far as I knew, I had no ownership in it at all. Still, Caleb ended the message with one sentence that made me close the spreadsheet on my screen. "We can't complete the purchase without your signature." I called him back from the stairwell outside my office, where the concrete walls made every sound sharper than it needed to be. "This is Aloan Hartley," I said. "You left me a message about the workshop." There was a brief pause. "Thank you for calling. I was hoping we could clear up the consent requirement before Friday." "Before we clear that up, who told you I knew the workshop was being sold?" Another pause, longer this time. "Your family really didn't tell you?" I stared through the narrow stairwell window at the parking garage across the street. "No." Caleb's voice became more careful. He explained that his company had been negotiating with the Hartley family holding company for several weeks. An offer had been accepted. Inspections were complete. The title review had uncovered a restricted, use provision connected to part of the building, and the transaction required written consent from someone named in the original agreement. Me. He would not interpret the document for me over the phone, which I respected more than if he had tried. He only said the closing package had been sent to Miles, and Miles had assured him every required person was aware. "What exactly am I consenting to?" I asked. "A change in use affecting a section identified as Bay 3. The name pulled at something in my memory, but I could not place it quickly enough. "Send me the relevant pages," I said. "I'll review them." "I was told you'd already agreed." "You were told wrong." I ended the call and immediately dialed my mother. Marianne answered on the 4th ring, sounding slightly breathless. "Hello, Ann? I'm in the grocery store. Is everything okay?" "Hear you selling Grandpa's workshop?" The noise around her seemed to vanish, though I knew she had only stopped moving. "Who called you?" That was answer enough. "A man named Caleb Mercer, the buyer," Mom exhaled slowly. "We were going to tell you once everything was settled." "It sounds settled already." "The family accepted a very good offer," she said. "The building is expensive to maintain, and there isn't enough work coming through anymore. Miles has been dealing with all of it since your grandfather died." Her tone was practical, almost rehearsed. I could picture her standing beside a cart, one hand pressed against her temple, wishing I had asked this question after the papers were signed. Why wasn't I included? "Because you haven't been involved with the workshop in years." "Eloan." The sentence landed harder because it was not entirely false. I lived 3 hours away. I had a career, an apartment, and a life that did not revolve around the town where I grew up. Miles had stayed. He knew the employees, the suppliers, and every machine Grandpa had refused to replace. Over time, the family had reduced all of that to a simple story. Miles cared enough to remain, and I had chosen to leave. "Caleb says he needs my consent," I said. "Why?" "It's probably one of those old formalities your grandfather created. You know how he was about the workshop. Miles can explain it better." I looked at my watch. I had a meeting in 10 minutes, but my entire attention had shifted 3 hours west. "Did you know my name was in the sale documents?" Mom hesitated. "I knew there might be something connected to the training area. Bay 3. Yes, that. But it hasn't been used properly in years." "And you didn't think I should know before the family accepted an offer?" "We didn't think it affected you financially." That was the moment I understood the problem was larger than being left out of a conversation. My family had decided that if something did not put money in my pocket, it did not concern me. "I'll call you later," I said. "Please don't turn this into a fight," Mom replied. "The sale makes sense." "I haven't said it doesn't." I hung up before she could answer. My phone rang almost immediately. Miles. I let it ring twice before picking up. Mom called you fast. Caleb called me first, I said. Why didn't you? Miles gave a short laugh that sounded more tired than amused. Because I knew exactly what would happen. You'd see your name on one old document and assume everyone was trying to take something from you. Am I losing something? No. That's the point. You don't own the workshop, you're not being cut out of proceeds. The offer is solid, everyone agreed, and the buyer needs one signature because Grandpa wrote sentimental restrictions into half the paperwork he ever touched. He spoke smoothly, the way someone does when they has repeated the explanation enough times to believe it should end every discussion. Send me the full document, I said. You don't need the full document. There's a consent page. Sign it, email it back. And this is done? Then sending the rest shouldn't be a problem. Silence. Aloan, don't turn this into something it isn't. I looked through the stairwell door toward my office, where my manager was walking into the conference room with a folder under his arm. I don't know what it is yet, I said. That's why I'm not signing. Miles muttered something under his breath, then said he would forward the pages. The attachment arrived 20 minutes later while I was sitting in the meeting, pretending to listen to a discussion about flooring allowances. I waited until lunch to open it. The first page listed the family holding company as the seller and Caleb's business as the buyer. My name did not appear under ownership. It did not appear under distribution of proceeds. It appeared near the bottom of the next page beside a separate signature line. Successor Steward Eloan Hartley. I read it 3 times. Beneath it was a reference to a restricted use area designated as Bay 3. The words finally unlocked the memory Caleb's call had stirred. Under the center workbench in Grandpa's shop, there had been a small brass plate, darkened around the screws by decades of dust. Hartley Community Apprenticeship Bay 3. As a child, I had assumed it was a leftover sign from some old program Grandpa had once run. I had never asked why he kept it polished when nearly everything else in the workshop was allowed to age naturally. I closed the attachment and looked at the electronic signature button Miles wanted me to click. Then I opened a new email. I told Caleb I would not approve anything remotely. I would come to the workshop and review Bay 3 myself. Friday's closing was only 3 days away, but that was no longer my biggest concern. My family had sold Grandpa's workshop without telling me, and somehow the one part they considered irrelevant was the only part they could not sell without my permission. By the time I reached Hartley Workshop the next morning, the place already looked like it belonged to someone else. Small white inventory tags hung from the drill press, the edge sander, and 2 cabinets Grandpa had built before I was born. Blue tape marked measurements across the concrete floor. Half the shelves near the loading bay had been emptied, leaving pale rectangles where tool cases and supply bins had blocked years of dust. I stood just inside the main entrance with my keys still in my hand, listening for the sounds I remembered. The planer winding down, a radio playing too quietly beneath the machines, Grandpa tapping a pencil against wood while he checked a measurement. There was only the hum of the overhead lights. The family had not merely discussed selling the workshop. Someone had already started dismantling its life. I walked past the main production floor toward the rear of the building. Bay 3 was behind an old sliding partition, but before I reached it, the side door opened and Miles came in carrying a cardboard tray with 2 coffees. He wore work boots and the same dark canvas jacket he had worn to Grandpa's memorial. "I figured you'd come early," he said. He offered me one of the cups. I didn't take it. "How long have they been tagging equipment?" "About a week." Before I was told, "The equipment isn't part of your consent." "That isn't what I asked." Miles set both coffees on a desk near the office window. "You said you wanted to see the paperwork. I brought the ownership records." He opened a folder and laid several pages across the desk. I recognized the holding company name from Caleb's attachment. Grandpa had created Hartley Works Lelk years earlier, then divided its membership between my mother, two of her siblings, and Miles's father. After Grandpa died, the remaining interest passed according to his estate plan. My name appeared nowhere in the ownership schedule. Miles watched me read. "There it is," he said. "You don't own the building. You don't own some hidden share. Nobody sold something that belonged to you." I didn't say they did. "You drove 3 hours instead of signing a 1-page form. Because the buyer said he can't close without me." Miles leaned against the desk and folded his arms. Grandpa attached an old use restriction to one section of the shop. "It was sentimental, that's all." "If it's only sentimental, why is my consent required?" "Because he named you in it years ago." "Why?" Miles glanced toward the workshop floor. "You know how Grandpa was. He liked making everything sound permanent." That answer was smooth, but it wasn't an answer. I closed the folder. "Show me Bay 3. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "It's just 3 benches and old equipment." "Then this should be quick." He led me across the shop. We passed a stack of packing blankets and several wooden crates marked for removal. At the rear partition, Miles pulled the sliding door aside. Bay 3 was smaller than I remembered, maybe a quarter of the rear wing. 3 heavy workbenches stood in a row beneath long fluorescent fixtures. A tool rack covered one wall. Safety posters curled at the corners near a small sink. The brass plate was still attached beneath the center bench, though dust had dulled most of the lettering. "Hartley Community Apprenticeship, Bay 3. I crouched and wiped my thumb across the word apprenticeship. "When was this last used?" "Not properly." "Years ago." I stood and looked around again. One bench had a deep collection of scratches and glue stains. Another held a vise with clean metal along the screw. Near the sharpening station, a thin crescent of pale dust lay beneath the wheel. It was not enough to prove anything, but it did not look like a room abandoned for years. I spent my working life estimating renovations from spaces that rarely told the truth at first glance. Fresh repairs showed up against old surfaces. Recently moved equipment left clean outlines. Replaced belts were darker than the dry rubber around them. "That sander belt isn't old," I said. Miles looked at it. "Maintenance probably changed it." "Why maintain equipment in a room nobody uses?" "Because the machines still belong to the workshop." I touched the edge of a pair of safety goggles hanging beside the rack. They were cleaner than the shelf beneath them. "And these?" "Helloan, what exactly are you trying to prove?" "Nothing yet." That seemed to irritate him more than an accusation would have. "The shop has been losing money. Grandpa kept programs alive long after they stopped making sense because he hated admitting anything had ended. We're not erasing history. We're selling a building." Caleb isn't asking me to approve the history. He's asking me to approve changing this space. Before Miles could answer, the rear door opened and a woman stepped inside carrying an empty plastic storage tote. I recognized Nora Bell after a second. She had managed invoices, schedules, and supply orders for Grandpa for nearly 20 years. Her grey hair was shorter now, and she wore a faded green coat zipped to her chin. "I thought nobody would be here this early," she said. Then she saw me. "Helloan." "Nora." She smiled and hugged me with one arm, keeping hold of the tote with the other. Miles looked toward the office. "Your boxes are ready?" "Thank you." Nora's eyes moved past us into Bay 3. "Your grandfather would have hated seeing those benches empty." Miles exhaled through his nose. "We were just discussing the old apprenticeship program." "Hold," Nora asked. The single word changed the room. Miles picked up one of the coffees he had carried in. "It hasn't operated as a real program for years." Nora did not argue immediately. She stepped into Bay 3 and ran her fingers along the first bench. "It was never a formal school, if that's what you mean." "That is what I mean." "But Lawrence never considered this ordinary shop space." She looked at me. "He kept separate supply records for Bay 3, separate schedules too." "Do those records still exist?" I asked. Nora glanced toward a grey metal cabinet against the far wall. They should. Miles checked his phone. I have a supplier call in 5 minutes. He pointed toward the office. The ownership folder is there. Read whatever you want. Just remember the buyer can walk if this drags out. Then he left us alone. Nora watched him go before setting down her tote. She opened the grey cabinet and pulled the top drawer. It contained instruction manuals, old warranty cards, and a handful of blank safety forms. The second drawer was nearly empty. Nora frowned. What? I asked. She slid it open farther. There used to be folders here. Attendance notes, supply receipts, names of people Lawrence was training. When did you last see them? Before your grandfather died. Maybe a month or 2 before. Could they have been moved during the estate cleanup? Of course. She did not sound convinced, but she also did not turn uncertainty into an accusation. I appreciated that. Who handled the cleanup? Mostly Miles. I helped with the office, but he sorted the workshop records. I looked back at the empty drawer. Missing files could mean something. Or they could mean that someone had placed old paperwork in the wrong box. I was not going to build a theory around an empty cabinet. What did you mean when you said Grandpa didn't consider Bay 3 ordinary shop space? Nora rested one hand on the drawer. He used to say it wasn't inventory. What does that mean? I never asked him to explain it legally. She gave me a tired smile. With Lawrence, it usually meant he believed something had a purpose beyond what it could sell for. That answer brought me no closer to knowing what authority Grandpa had given me, but it told me where not to look. The ownership records could prove what I did not own. Miles could keep calling the restriction sentimental. Neither explained why a buyer needed my permission to erase Bay 3 from the plans. I took out my phone and sent Caleb a message. Can we meet today? I need to understand exactly what my signature changes. His reply came before I had put the phone away. Yes, noon. I looked around the small room again. The fresh belt, the clean goggles, the fine dust near the sharpening wheel. Miles said Bay 3 had been inactive for years. The room did not agree with him, and if Grandpa had kept its records separate from the rest of the workshop, then the missing files were not the most important question. The real question was what Bay 3 had been doing recently, and why Miles needed everyone to believe it had stopped long ago. Caleb Mercer chose a small coffee shop on the edge of town instead of his office, which immediately made me trust him a little more. It felt less like a negotiation and more like a conversation between 2 people trying to understand the same problem from different directions. When I walked in, he was already sitting near the window, with a leather portfolio on the table and 2 mugs of coffee waiting. He stood to shake my hand. He looked younger than I had imagined from his voice, maybe early 40s, wearing jeans, a navy sweater, and the kind of work boots that suggested he actually visited construction sites instead of just reading reports about them. Thank you for coming, he said. I wish we'd met under different circumstances. So do I. I sat across from him. I have one request before we start. Go ahead. Please don't tell me what my family meant. Just tell me what the paperwork says. A small smile crossed his face. That's actually easier. He opened the portfolio and spread several documents across the table. Unlike Miles, Caleb didn't begin with explanations. He started with floor plans. This, he said, pointing to the rear portion of the building, is the area we intended to renovate. Bay 3 sat inside a shaded section covering roughly a quarter of the workshop's back wing. My company restores architectural salvage, Caleb explained. All doors, stained glass, reclaimed hardwood, historic fixtures. We need climate-controlled storage more than additional production space. The rear section of your grandfather's workshop is ideal. Hand Bay 3. It's inside that footprint. He slid another page toward me. That's where your consent comes in. The document was older than the others, a scanned copy with Grandpa's unmistakable signature at the bottom. I expected complicated legal language, but what surprised me most was how specific it was. The agreement never mentioned ownership. It never suggested I inherited part of the workshop. Instead, It identified Bay 3 as a designated apprenticeship area whose use could not be permanently converted to another purpose without written approval from the named successor steward. My name, Eloan Hartley. I read the paragraph again, slower this time. So I finally said, looking up, I don't own this part of the building. Correct. I don't receive extra money if it's sold. Correct. I can't tell everyone what to do with the rest of the workshop. Also correct. Then all I actually control, Caleb nodded before finished, is whether Bay 3 permanently stops being used for training. I leaned back in my chair and laughed once. Not because anything was funny, but because it was so completely different from what I'd expected. For 2 days I had wondered whether Grandpa had secretly left me part of the business. Instead, he had left me responsibility without reward. Did my grandfather ever explain this to you? I asked. No. I only learned about the covenant during title review. Caleb folded his hands. Honestly, when I first saw it, I assumed your family had discussed it years ago. Apparently not. Or they discussed it differently. That sentence stayed with me. Caleb wasn't accusing anyone. He was simply acknowledging that documents and family stories weren't always the same thing. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. Why do you think your grandfather chose you? I looked out the window at traffic moving through town. I honestly have no idea. That answer bothered me more than anything else I'd learned. Miles had stayed. Miles knew every machine in that workshop. Miles had worked beside Grandpa almost every day during the last decade. If someone deserved authority over Bay 3, logic suggested it should have been him. Unless Grandpa had seen something I hadn't, or unless I was still missing part of the story. Caleb packed away the covenant but left the floor plan on the table. Whatever you decide, he said. I need you to know something. What? I'm buying a property. Not trying to erase your grandfather. It wasn't the kind of statement someone practiced. It sounded almost awkward. If your decision is no, I'll respect it. If it's yes, I'll respect that too. I just need to know I'm dealing with the person your grandfather intended. I thanked him for the coffee and drove back to the workshop instead of heading toward the highway. I wasn't ready to leave, not anymore. Nora was sitting on an overturned crate near the office, sorting through a stack of faded supply catalogs when I walked in. Did you get your answers? She asked. Some. I pulled up another crate beside her. I know what my signature actually does now. Hand. Grandpa didn't leave me the workshop. Nora smiled slightly. I never thought he did. He only gave me authority over Bay 3. Her smile faded into something thoughtful. That sounds much more like Lawrence. You don't seem surprised. Your grandfather believed ownership and responsibility weren't always the same thing. She closed the catalogue in her lap. Most people think property is about who gets the keys. Lawrence cared more about who protected the reason something existed. I let that settle before asking the question that had been following me all morning. Tell me about the apprenticeship program. Nora's face softened. Most people around town barely knew it existed. She explained that Grandpa never advertised it. He wasn't running a school or a non-profit. If a young person wanted to learn woodworking but couldn't afford trade classes, or simply needed someone patient enough to teach them safely, Grandpa invited them into Bay 3 after normal business hours. Some stayed a few weeks, others stayed years. Did he charge them? I asked. Sometimes, sometimes not. Depends what they could manage. How many? Had changed. She shrugged. 3 at one point, 5 another year, 1 during the pandemic. Lawrence never cared about numbers. I looked toward Bay 3 through the open partition. Miles told me the program died years ago. Nora hesitated just long enough for me to notice. I wasn't working here every evening toward the end, she admitted carefully. Miles handled more of the day, today after your grandfather's health slowed him down. But, she sighed, I never thought of Bay 3 as dead. That wasn't proof. It wasn't even evidence. It was simply the opinion of someone who had known Grandpa well. Still, it conflicted with Miles's certainty. I walked into Bay 3 alone. The afternoon sunlight reached only halfway across the floor, before fading into the cool fluorescent light overhead. I moved slowly past each bench until I reached the sharpening station again. This time I looked closer. Small inspection tags hung from several machines. One tag on an old planer caught my attention. Service completed 7 months ago. Approved by MH, I frowned. Grandpa had died 5 months earlier. If the machine had been serviced only 7 months ago, someone had expected it to keep working. My eyes moved to another tool. Similar date. Same initials. MAH Miles Hartley. I crouched beside the planer and ran my fingers lightly across the edge of the freshly maintained guide rail. The metal still carried a thin film of machine oil. It wasn't neglected equipment preserved for nostalgia. Someone had cared enough to maintain it shortly before Grandpa died. I stood and looked around Bay 3 again. Suddenly every detail seemed slightly different. The clean goggles, the newer drive belt, the sharpening dust. None of them proved the apprenticeship program was active. Maintenance alone didn't mean students were still coming through those doors. But they did prove one thing. Miles had known Bay 3 well enough to authorize work on its equipment only months before Grandpa passed away. Yet he had looked me in the eye that morning and described the entire space as something that hadn't mattered for years. Those two facts could both be true, only if there was an explanation I still hadn't heard. I pulled out my phone, took a picture of the maintenance tag, then slipped the phone back into my pocket without sending it to anyone. I wasn't interested in cornering Miles with a photograph. Not yet. I needed to understand whether he had lied, or whether I was still asking the wrong question. As I turned to leave Bay 3, my foot brushed against a small plastic container beneath the center bench. It rattled softly. Inside were neatly stacked name tags from safety goggles, each labeled with a first name in faded black marker. Javier, Emma, Tyler. 3 ordinary names. 3 people I had never heard my grandfather mention. Suddenly the mystery wasn't just why Grandpa had chosen me. It was much simpler than that. If Bay 3 had really stopped functioning years ago, why were there still names waiting for people who were supposed to have disappeared? The 3 names stayed in my head the entire drive to Javier Ruiz's job site. I could have called him, but after the last 3 days I had grown tired of conversations where long silences hid almost as much as words. If Bay 3 had mattered recently, I wanted to hear it from someone who had actually stood at those benches. Nora had found an address through an old emergency contact sheet, and by noon I was pulling into the parking lot of a small commercial building where several carpenters were installing custom trim. A man wearing safety glasses looked up when I introduced myself. "You're Lawrence Hartley's granddaughter?" he asked. "I am." His expression immediately changed from polite curiosity to confusion. His Bay 3 reopening. It was the second time someone had asked me that question in less than 24 hours. "I don't know," I admitted. "I was actually hoping you could answer a few questions." Javier asked one of the crew leaders for 10 minutes, then led me outside to a shaded picnic table beside the building. He set down his hard hat and took a bottle of water from a cooler. "I figured someone from the family would have called eventually," he said. "Not me," I replied. "Apparently I'm the last person to know almost everything." He looked uncomfortable. "You really didn't know?" "Know what?" "That your grandfather was still teaching." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "When was the last time you were in Bay 3? Javier frowned as he counted backward. "Maybe 3 weeks before Mr. Hartley passed away." My heart sank. 3 weeks? Yeah. He seemed surprised by my surprise. We were finishing hand-cut dovetails. He kept saying machines save time, but handwork teaches patience. I stared at him. Miles had told me the apprenticeship program had effectively died years ago. Nora hadn't directly contradicted him because she hadn't been at the workshop every evening. But Javier wasn't talking about vague memories from the distant past. He was describing individual lessons that happened only months ago. "How many people were training?" I asked. 3 of us toward the end. Sometimes 2 if someone had to work late. "Do you remember their names?" "Hummer and Tyler." The same names I'd seen inside the plastic container beneath Grandpa's workbench. Suddenly they weren't faded labels anymore. They belonged to real people. What happened after my grandfather died? Javier looked down at the bottle in his hands. Miles called us? What did he say? That the insurance situation had changed. He said outside trainees couldn't use the shop anymore. Did you question it? He shrugged. Not really. It's his family business. We figured everything changed after Lawrence was gone. Did anyone ever tell you the building was being sold? No. Did Miles say the apprenticeship program had ended before Grandpa died? Javier shook his head immediately. No. Just that it couldn't continue. That difference mattered. It wasn't proof Miles had lied, but it made his version of events much harder to accept. I thanked Javier for his time and drove straight to my mother's house instead of returning to the workshop. The conversation in the coffee shop had answered one question. Javier had just opened another. If Bay 3 had still been active only weeks before Grandpa died, why had everyone making decisions about the sale been told it had been inactive for years? Mom opened the front door before I reached the porch. She must have seen my car through the kitchen window. You look exhausted, she said. I feel worse than that. She stepped aside and let me in. The smell of fresh coffee filled the house. Nothing about it had changed since Grandpa's funeral except the silence. I talked to one of Grandpa's apprentices, I said. Mom stopped halfway to the kitchen. His what? His apprentices. Bay 3 didn't stop operating years ago. She stared at me as though I had switched languages halfway through the sentence. What are you talking about? Javier Ruiz trained there until 3 weeks before Grandpa died. Mom slowly lowered herself into a chair. Miles told all of us. She stopped. What? He said your grandfather hadn't really been teaching anyone for years. That Bay 3 had become storage with a few old benches. That's not what happened. I told her everything Javier had said. She listened without interrupting, her expression becoming more troubled with every minute. When I finished, she stood and disappeared into the hallway. A minute later she returned carrying a thick binder. This is the presentation Miles put together before we voted on the sale, she said quietly. Presentation. Her wanted everyone to understand the numbers. She opened the binder to a color floor plan. Every section of the workshop was labeled according to its proposed future use. Then she turned another page. There it was, Bay 3. The description beneath it read, unused rear production space, inactive for several years. I read the sentence twice before looking back at Mom. Everyone saw this, she nodded. We all assumed it was accurate. Did anyone ask about the apprenticeship program? No, she rubbed her forehead. Honestly. I thought your grandfather had given that up long before he died. 'Cause Miles said he had. Mom didn't defend him. She didn't even try. Instead she stared at the page for several seconds before quietly saying, I should have asked more questions. That wasn't the dramatic apology I might have imagined a few days earlier. Somehow it felt more real. She wasn't trying to erase what had happened. She was acknowledging exactly where she'd stopped thinking for herself. Mom, I said carefully, did Grandpa ever talk to you about Bay 3? Only in general. Nothing about me. No. She looked genuinely puzzled. The stewardship paperwork never came up. When Miles said the training program had faded away, I assumed whatever restrictions your grandfather created had become meaningless. That explanation didn't erase her part in excluding me, but it changed how I understood it. She hadn't decided I didn't matter. She had accepted someone else's interpretation without checking whether it was complete. There was a difference. Before either of us could say anything else, my phone rang. Caleb. I stepped onto the back porch before answering. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but I finished recalculating the renovation budget. You already have new numbers. Because I needed to understand what happens if Bay 3 stays exactly as it is. I waited. If that area remains dedicated to training instead of becoming storage. He paused, almost as though he disliked saying the next sentence. My offer drops by about $186,000. I looked across Mom's backyard toward the maple tree Grandpa had planted when I was in elementary school. $186,000. Suddenly Bay 3 wasn't just an old workshop corner protected by sentimental paperwork. It had a measurable financial value. Keeping Grandpa's purpose alive cost real money. Did Miles know that? I asked quietly. He knew removing the restriction increased the property's value. We discussed several renovation options. Caleb wasn't accusing anyone. He was simply answering the question I had asked. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate your honesty." After we hung up, I stayed on the porch for another minute, letting the number settle in my mind. $186,000 explained something important. It explained why Bay 3 had become a negotiation point, but it still didn't explain why Miles had described an active apprenticeship program as something abandoned years earlier. There had to be another piece I was missing. When I walked back inside, Mom was still sitting at the kitchen table with the binder open. She looked up as I entered. "More bad news?" she asked. "Maybe." I closed the binder gently. "How much of this sale actually matters to Miles personally?" Mom looked surprised by the question. Then her expression slowly changed. It wasn't an answer. It was the realization that she had never asked herself the same thing. I didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't because of the money. $186,000 was a significant difference in the sale price. But numbers had never frightened me. I worked with budgets and construction estimates every day. Numbers explained problems. People complicated them. What kept me awake was the realization that every answer I uncovered changed the question instead of ending it. I now knew Bay 3 had still been active shortly before Grandpa died. I knew my family had voted on the sale using information that wasn't completely accurate. I knew Grandpa had trusted me with responsibility instead of ownership. But I still didn't understand why he had believed I was the right person to carry it. By sunrise, I had made one decision. I wasn't signing anything on Friday, whether that delayed the sale by 1 day or 1 month. I needed enough time to understand what Grandpa had actually asked me to protect. I arrived at the workshop just after 8. Miles was already inside the office, studying invoices spread across his desk. He looked up as I walked in, and from his expression I could tell he already knew I hadn't emailed Caleb a signed consent form. "Tell me you're here to finish this?" he said. "I'm here to ask for 1 week." He leaned back in his chair. "Horn week for what?" "To understand what Bay 3 was supposed to become." "You already understand." "No, I understand what the paperwork says. I don't understand why Grandpa wrote it." Miles rubbed both hands across his face before answering. "Closing is Friday." "Move it. It's not that simple." "Then explain why." He was quiet for several seconds. "Because people are waiting." "Ho. Everyone." "That's not an answer." His patience finally cracked. "Do you honestly think this is just about me wanting to sell Grandpa's building?" "I don't know what it's about. That's exactly why I'm asking questions." He stood and walked to the office window overlooking the workshop floor. The family already planned around this closing. Taxes, repairs, medical bills, college tuition for Sarah's youngest. Everyone has been expecting those proceeds for weeks. Horn Week doesn't erase the sale. It might. He turned to face me. "Caleb isn't required to wait forever." "I'm not asking forever." "You're asking at exactly the wrong time." His response wasn't angry, it was anxious. That difference mattered. Anxiety usually pointed toward something real. "Miles," I said more quietly, "what happens to you if this deal doesn't close on Friday?" He looked away again. That told me more than any answer could have. "Come with me," he finally said. 15 minutes later we were standing inside the furniture workshop he had expanded 3 years earlier on the other side of town. The building was larger than Grandpa's shop but strangely quieter. Half the assembly station sat empty. Several expensive woodworking machines had protective covers pulled over them. Along one wall stood stacks of unfinished cabinets waiting for hardware that hadn't been installed yet. "This was supposed to be our growth shop," Miles said. "Hotels, restaurants, commercial millwork." I walked slowly through the building. There was nothing fake about it. The equipment was real. The investment was obvious. So was the lack of work. What happened? I asked. A regional hotel project fell apart after financing collapsed. We hired people expecting it to move forward. He pointed towards several unused workstations. Those orders never came. How long? Almost a year. And the workshop sale covers enough debt to let us shrink without closing completely. He said it flatly, without asking for sympathy. I've already sold 2 delivery trucks. I cancelled equipment orders. I've done everything I can before touching Grandpa's property. I looked around again. Suddenly the extra $186,000 had a face. It wasn't greed, it was payroll, equipment loans, and employees with families. Why didn't you tell me this? I asked. Because it isn't your responsibility. Apparently Bay 3 is. Miles laughed bitterly. Exactly. We stood in silence for a moment. Finally he spoke again. Do you know what everyone says about us? No? That I stayed because I couldn't imagine doing anything else. He shook his head. The truth is I stayed because somebody had to. Grandpa never asked me to stay. No. He asked you to leave. That sentence stopped me. Miles saw the surprise on my face. You don't remember? I did. Not all at once, but in pieces. Grandpa standing beside my old pickup truck the morning I left for my first estimating job. My suitcase already loaded. Me apologizing for moving so far away. Him resting one rough hand on the truck door and saying, "Or one heartily tied to this building is enough." At the time I had laughed, because I thought he was trying to make leaving easier. I had never considered that he meant it literally. He wanted you to build a life somewhere else, Miles continued. He wanted someone in this family who could make decisions without worrying whether the workshop paid their mortgage. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The words fit too neatly with everything Caleb had shown me. Responsibility without ownership, independence without profit. Had Grandpa planned that years ago, or was Miles only guessing? Then why are you fighting me? I asked. Because you walked away. There was no anger in his voice now, only exhaustion. You got to build another career, another life. I stayed here every day trying to keep this place alive. Now you come back after 5 months, and suddenly your signature matters more than everything I've done. I understood the feeling, even if I disagreed with his conclusion. Staying doesn't automatically make every decision yours. Maybe not. He looked around the nearly empty building. But leaving doesn't usually make them yours either. I drove back toward my mother's house with more sympathy for Miles than I'd expected to have that morning. He hadn't built some elaborate scheme to steal the workshop. He was trying to save the business that had become his entire adult life. That didn't excuse how he'd presented Bay 3 to the family, but it made his choices understandable in a way simple greed never could. My phone buzzed before I reached town. 3 missed calls. 2 text messages from relatives asking whether Friday's closing was still happening. 1 voicemail from my aunt wondering if there was some misunderstanding. Holding everything up, news traveled quickly. Apparently the family had already realized the buyer was waiting for me. Instead of returning each call separately, I sent 1 message to the family group chat. I'm reviewing Grandpa's stewardship agreement. I'll explain everything once I have complete information. Please don't ask Caleb for updates through me. The replies arrived almost immediately. Some were polite. Some weren't. 1 cousin asked whether I was trying to stop the sale altogether. Another reminded everyone how much money had already been budgeted. I read them once, then set the phone face down on the passenger seat. For years I had been the person who answered every misunderstanding individually, trying to keep peace 1 conversation at a time. This time I wasn't going to defend myself 20 different ways. If the truth mattered, everyone could hear it together. When I reached Mom's house, she was sitting at the dining table with her laptop open and several old folders spread around it. "You've been busy," I said. "I kept thinking about what you told me yesterday." She looked up. Miles was wrong about Bay 3. Then I wanted to check everything else instead of assuming. She hesitated before holding up a printed email. "I found something in your grandfather's archived files." Across the top was a subject line that made my stomach tighten before I read a single word. Why it can't be Miles, I looked at Mom. What is this? I don't know yet. She slid the paper across the table. I only read the first paragraph. My eyes dropped to Grandpa's words. I expected criticism, distrust, some hidden confession explaining why he had chosen me over Miles. Instead, the first sentence read, Miles knows this workshop better than anyone alive, and that is exactly why the next decision cannot belong to him alone. I stopped reading. Whatever Grandpa had written after that, it wasn't going to be the story I had imagined. I read Grandpa's first sentence 3 more times before I continued. Every version of this story I had built inside my head over the last few days collapsed with that single line. He wasn't warning the family about Miles. He wasn't calling him dishonest. He wasn't secretly choosing one grandchild over the other. If anything, he was doing the opposite. He was acknowledging that Miles understood the workshop better than anyone else. Then why couldn't the final decision belong to him? I sat down across from my mother and kept reading. Grandpa's email had been written almost 4 years before he died. It wasn't addressed to the entire family. It was addressed only to Mom. Marianne, if you're reading this, it probably means we're finally putting my affairs in order again. I need you to understand something before lawyers turn it into legal language. Miles loves this workshop more than anyone. That is exactly why he should never be the only person deciding whether Bay 3 survives. The person whose future depends on the building's financial success should not also have sole authority over the part of it that exists for reasons money cannot measure. I stopped again. My mother quietly watched me without interrupting. Grandpa wasn't criticizing Miles. He was describing a conflict that could happen to anyone. If your business depended on squeezing every possible dollar out of a building, preserving an unprofitable training space would always feel like a sacrifice. It wasn't a question of character. It was a question of incentives. I continued reading. Miles will protect the business. I believe that completely. What I need is someone willing to protect the purpose that does not earn its keep on a balance sheet. Those jobs are different. They should belong to different people. I slowly lowered the paper. He separated the responsibilities. I whispered. Mom nodded, her eyes fixed on the table. I didn't understand it when I first read this years ago. I looked up. You read this before. She closed her eyes for a second before answering. Yes? There was no excuse in her voice, only regret. When Grandpa updated his estate documents, he asked me to print several emails for the attorney. I read this one before I filed it away. Then why didn't you tell me? She looked down at her hands. Because at the time, Bay 3 was still running. Nothing had changed. Then your grandfather got older. Miles started handling more of the workshop. Eventually he told us the apprenticeship program had faded away. She took a slow breath. Halts, I believed that this email stopped feeling important. So when Miles said Bay 3 wasn't really being used anymore, I accepted it without checking. She didn't try to defend herself. I assumed your father's side of the family understood the workshop better than I did. I let someone else's confidence replace my own judgment. That admission hurt because it sounded painfully ordinary. There wasn't some dramatic conspiracy that had erased me from the conversation. There was something much more believable. Everyone trusted the person who had stayed. Everyone assumed the details matched his conclusions. Nobody bothered asking whether they did. I'm sorry, Mom said quietly. Not because you were left out of the money. Because I stopped asking questions before I should have. I folded Grandpa's email carefully and placed it back on the table. You know what surprises me most? What? I never expected Bay 3 to stay exactly the same. Mom frowned. What do you mean? I pointed to another paragraph farther down the page. If the program needs to change one day, let it change. If another group can teach better than we can, let them. If the building must evolve, let it. Protect the opportunity, not the furniture. That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Protect the opportunity, not the furniture. Grandpa hadn't been trying to freeze the workshop in time. He wasn't asking me to preserve every workbench forever. He was asking me to protect the reason Bay 3 existed, even if everything around it changed. The distinction was enormous. Instead of driving home, I went back to the workshop and found Nora loading another storage box into the back of her SUV. "Can I ask you one more question?" I said. She smiled. "You haven't run out yet. Not even close." We carried the box inside together. After I showed her grandpa's email, she read the paragraph about protecting opportunity twice before handing it back. "That sounds exactly like Lawrence," she said. "Did he ever talk about the future of the apprenticeship program?" "Actually." She leaned against one of the empty shelves, thinking. "About a year before he died, he started meeting with someone from the County Technical Education Office." My attention sharpened immediately. For what? He thought younger people were learning differently than they had 30 years ago. He wondered whether Bay 3 could partner with existing trade programs instead of operating completely on its own. Did anything happen? Nora shook her head. Nothing formal. They exchanged ideas, a couple of visits. Then his health declined. So he wasn't trying to preserve the workshop exactly as it was. No, she smiled softly. Lawrence loved woodworking, not museums. That answered another question I hadn't realized I was asking. If Grandpa had expected Bay 3 to evolve, then perhaps the real choice wasn't between selling the workshop and saving it. Maybe there was another path. Before leaving, I called Caleb and asked whether he could meet me at the building the following morning. He arrived carrying rolled floor plans under one arm. We spread them across the largest bench in Bay 3. Hypothetically, I began. If this space remained dedicated to training, could the rest of the sale still work? Caleb studied the plans for a long moment. Technically. Yes. Practically. He smiled. That's more complicated. He pointed to several walls with a pencil. Would need a separate entrance, fire separation, different utility routing. We'd lose storage volume. Would the project still be profitable? Yes. He paused. Just less profitable. Enough that you'd walk away. No, that single word changed everything. Then why wasn't this discussed before? I asked. Caleb gave an honest shrug. Because everyone negotiating on the seller's side told me Bay 3 no longer served a meaningful purpose. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Finally, he rolled the plans back up. "If you're thinking about redesigning the deal," he said, "the numbers have to work for everyone." "I know. Do you?" he asked gently. "Your cousin loses money if Bay 3 stays." "I know that too," he nodded. "Then you're asking the right question." After Caleb left, I remained alone in Bay 3. I walked slowly around the room, measuring distances almost automatically. 20 feet from the rear wall to the first bench. Existing utility chase. Exterior access near the loading dock. Fire, rated partition possible without affecting structural columns. Years of estimating commercial renovations had trained my brain to see solutions before drawings existed. For the first time since Caleb's voicemail, I wasn't looking for hidden motives or missing files. I was looking for a workable plan. I took out my notebook and began sketching rough dimensions. If Bay 3 had its own entrance, if storage shifted toward the northwest corner, if mechanical systems were rerouted. I stopped halfway through the page and laughed quietly to myself. Grandpa hadn't chosen me because I loved the workshop more than Miles. He had chosen me because I didn't depend on it for my living. And somehow, because I'd spent 15 years solving construction problems somewhere else, I had become the one person in the family capable of imagining a solution that wasn't simply yes or no. By the time I finished the first rough layout, the afternoon sun had moved across the windows and stretched long shadows over the empty benches. Tomorrow, I would show Miles 2 possibilities instead of 1. He could keep fighting over whether Bay 3 deserved to exist, or we could figure out how both Grandpa's purpose and the workshop's future might survive together. I had no idea which choice he would make. But for the first time since this story began, I wasn't chasing answers anymore. I was preparing to make a decision. I barely slept the night before the meeting, not because I doubted Grandpa anymore. That part had finally become clear. I barely slept because I knew whatever happened next would permanently change my relationship with my family. Up until now, I had only been asking questions. Questions are uncomfortable, but people usually forgive them. Decisions are different. Decisions leave someone disappointed. By 9 o'clock the next morning, everyone who mattered was standing inside Grandpa's workshop. Caleb had rolled the updated floor plans across the large assembly table. Mom stood quietly beside the office door with her arms folded. Nora leaned against the wall near Bay 3, saying almost nothing. Miles arrived last. The circles beneath his eyes told me he hadn't slept much either. Caleb looked around the room before speaking. I appreciate everyone making time. Mess. Hartley asked me to evaluate an alternative layout that preserves Bay 3 while allowing the transaction to proceed. Miles looked directly at me. So we're doing this? Yes, I answered. We are. Caleb unrolled the revised drawings. Instead of converting the entire rear wing into climate-controlled storage, this plan creates an independent entrance to Bay 3 from the east side of the building. A fire-rated partition separates the apprenticeship area from the storage operation. Utilities are rerouted. Storage capacity decreases by roughly 22%. He paused before adding the part everyone already expected. Because of that reduction, my revised purchase price is lower than the original offer. No one spoke. Everyone knew exactly how much lower. Caleb looked toward Miles. Operationally, this still works for my business. It simply changes the economics. Miles stared at the plans for several seconds. How much time did you spend on this? He asked me. Most of yesterday. Instead of signing. Instead of guessing. I stepped beside the drawings and pointed toward the revised access corridor. This entrance already meets most accessibility requirements. The existing utility chase reduces relocation costs. The partition doesn't affect structural framing. I looked at Caleb. You confirmed the numbers. He nodded. They're realistic. Miles slowly walked around the table, studying every note on the drawings. Finally, he looked at me. So this is your condition? Yes. You won't approve the original sale. No, but you'll approve this one. If Bay 3 remains protected the way Grandpa intended. He let out a slow breath. Everyone else. Could you give us a few minutes? Mom looked at me questioningly. I nodded once. Within seconds, the workshop became quiet, except for the sound of the office door closing behind them. Miles remained standing on one side of the table while I stood on the other. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he broke the silence. Do you know what the hardest part of this has been? Tell me. Watching someone who left 15 years ago come back and overrule decisions I've been carrying every single day. I didn't answer right away, because I knew he deserved more than a rehearsed response. I understand why that feels unfair, I said. Do you? Yes, you have your own career, your own apartment, your own life. I stayed when the roof leaked. I stayed when orders disappeared. I stayed when Grandpa couldn't lift plywood anymore. He placed one hand flat on the drawings. You weren't here. No, I said quietly. I wasn't. Then why should your signature matter more than everything I've done? I looked across the workshop toward Bay 3. It doesn't matter more. He frowned. Then why are we here? I met his eyes. Because staying and deciding aren't the same thing. He looked away for a moment. Easy for you to say. No. I shook my head. Actually, it isn't. I stepped around the table until we were standing beside the old workbench instead of facing each other across paper. Grandpa didn't choose me because I loved the workshop more than you. Miles remained silent. He chose me because I could say no when money was involved. You think that's what this is? I think that's exactly what he wrote. He laughed once without humor. So I'm just the greedy grandson? No. My answer came immediately. You're the grandson who built his entire future around this building. He looked at me for the first time since we'd started talking. That's different. Yes. I nodded. It is. We stood there in silence until he quietly asked the question I'd been waiting for. Do you really believe I lied to everyone? I thought carefully before answering. I believe you convinced yourself Bay 3 didn't matter anymore, because that made every other decision easier. He didn't deny it. Instead, he sat down on one of the old stools Grandpa used while sharpening chisels. When Grandpa got sick, he said, Staring at the floor, attendance kept dropping. People cancelled because they had jobs or families. Sometimes only one person showed up. Javier said there were still 3 trainees. Some weeks, he nodded slowly. Other weeks there was 1. He rubbed his forehead. Every month I looked at payroll, insurance, electricity, equipment maintenance. And every month Bay 3 cost more than it brought in. Because it wasn't supposed to bring in money. I know that now. He laughed softly, this time sounding more tired than bitter. Back then I thought I was protecting the workshop by sacrificing 1 room. He finally looked at me again. I knew your consent wasn't symbolic. There it was. Not a dramatic confession. Not a villain admitting an elaborate scheme. Just the truth. You knew. Yes. Then why didn't you tell me? He answered without hesitation. Because I thought if everyone else had already agreed, you wouldn't stop it. The words settled between us. They hurt because they sounded believable. He hadn't expected to trick me forever. He had expected family pressure to make my decision for me. You underestimated Grandpa, I said quietly. No, he gave a small, tired smile. I underestimated you. We returned to the meeting table together. Mom looked from one of us to the other, but didn't ask what had been said. Caleb simply waited. I placed Grandpa's stewardship document beside the revised sale agreement. I've made my decision. The room became completely still. I picked up the pen. For one brief moment I imagined what everyone expected. Some probably thought I would refuse to sign out of anger. Others probably expected me to give in for the sake of peace. Instead, I signed the revised agreement preserving Bay 3 exactly as the new plan described it. Caleb signed next. Mom quietly exhaled. Nora smiled to herself. Miles said nothing. The meeting ended with handshakes, revised schedules, and practical conversations about inspections and construction timelines. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no applause, no speeches about family. People simply began discussing the future instead of arguing about the past. As Caleb rolled up the drawings, I walked back toward Bay 3 one last time before leaving. I noticed something resting on the center workbench, the brass plaque. Hartley Community Apprenticeship, Bay 3. I picked it up carefully. The brass had been cleaned recently. I turned and saw Miles standing near the doorway. You took it down? I asked. He nodded once. The inspectors kept asking whether it stayed with the building. And I couldn't throw it away. He walked over slowly. I kept telling myself it was just a sign. His eyes settled on the plaque in my hands. Turns out it wasn't. Neither of us said anything else. We didn't need to. The plaque wasn't valuable. It wasn't part of the purchase price. It didn't change the legal agreement. But somehow it represented the difference between what Grandpa had built and what almost disappeared. As I slipped the plaque into my bag, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. The biggest victory wasn't that I had forced Miles to lose $186,000. The biggest victory was that neither of us had to lose Grandpa's purpose for the workshop. Money had changed hands, ownership had changed hands. The building itself would soon look different. But Bay 3 would continue doing exactly what Grandpa believed mattered most. And for the first time since Caleb's voicemail interrupted an ordinary Tuesday morning, I felt certain that my signature had meant exactly what Grandpa intended it to mean. 3 months later, the workshop barely resembled the place I had walked into after Caleb's first voicemail. Construction crews had already completed the new entrance on the east side of the building. Fresh concrete connected the parking area to a glass door bearing a simple brushed metal sign that read Bay 3 Apprenticeship Center. Caleb's company occupied the rest of the building exactly as planned. Historic doors, reclaimed beams, stained glass windows, and carefully labeled architectural salvage filled the renovated storage areas. Forklifts moved quietly through wide aisles that had once held stacks of unfinished cabinets. The building had changed, but it hadn't lost itself. It had simply become something larger than any one person had imagined. I arrived early that Saturday morning, carrying the brass plaque Miles had handed me after we signed the revised agreement. I had spent hours polishing it at my kitchen table, removing decades of tarnish without erasing the tiny scratches Grandpa had left behind. Before anyone else arrived, I mounted it beneath the center workbench, exactly where it had been for as long as I could remember. Hartley Community Apprenticeship, Bay 3. The letters caught the morning light for the first time in years. Looks better there than in your bag. I turned to find Miles standing in the doorway holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to me without saying anything else. It had become easier between us. Not perfect, probably never perfect, but honest, that mattered more. "How's the furniture shop?" I asked. "Smaller," he smiled faintly. "Healthier." After the revised sale closed, Miles had done what he originally hoped to avoid. He sold several underused machines, consolidated production into one section of his building, and focused on custom projects instead of chasing oversized commercial contracts that stretched his company too thin. He admitted later that he should have made those decisions long before Grandpa died. The extra $186,000 would only have delayed changes that were already necessary. Losing that money hadn't ruined his business. It had forced him to build one that actually matched reality. "You were right," he admitted quietly as we looked around Bay 3. "About what?" "I kept thinking I was protecting everything." He laughed softly. "Turns out I was trying to protect a version of the workshop that already couldn't survive." Grandpa would have understood that. Maybe. He looked toward the benches. "I just wish I'd understood it while he was still here." By 9 o'clock, the room filled with familiar faces. Nora arrived carrying a box of donated hand tools that former apprentices had collected after hearing Bay 3 would reopen. Javier came in wearing the same work boots I'd seen at his construction site, followed by Emma and Tyler, the 2 names I'd first discovered inside that dusty plastic container beneath Grandpa's bench. Seeing them together transformed those faded labels into living proof that Bay 3 had never simply been a room. It had always been people. Caleb arrived a few minutes later with rolled drawings under one arm and a framed certificate under the other. "What's that?" I asked. He smiled. "Occupancy approval." Everyone laughed. It was probably the least emotional moment of the morning, yet somehow it felt perfect. We had spent months talking about purpose, family, stewardship, and legacy, but none of it would have mattered without inspectors, permits, revised electrical plans, and signed paperwork. Grandpa had believed purpose should survive practical reality, not replace it. Mom stood quietly near the back wall watching everyone greet one another. When I walked over, she reached into her purse and handed me a sealed envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "The original printout of Grandpa's email." I looked at her. "You should keep it." She shook her head. No, her voice was steady. "For years I treated it like another estate document." "You treated it like a responsibility." She smiled sadly. "I think Grandpa knew which one it really was." I hugged her without saying anything. Some apologies don't need speeches. They need different choices afterward. Over the following months, Bay 3 became something Grandpa had only begun imagining. Instead of operating entirely on volunteers, the Apprenticeship Center partnered with the County Technical Education Program Nora had mentioned. High school seniors interested in skilled trades spent Saturday mornings learning basic woodworking safety, measurement, joinery, and finishing techniques before moving into internships with local businesses. Caleb donated reclaimed hardwood that couldn't be sold commercially but was perfect for training projects. Miles volunteered twice a month teaching cabinet construction and production workflow. I handled budgeting, grant applications, insurance renewals, and renovation planning whenever improvements became necessary. It took all 3 of us to accomplish what none of us could have protected alone. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after the sale, a teenage student stayed behind after everyone else had left. He couldn't have been older than 17. He ran one hand carefully across the center workbench before asking, "Why is this room called Bay 3? I smiled because I realized he wasn't asking about the number painted on the wall. He was asking about the story. Because one man believed every successful workshop should save space for the people who hadn't learned yet. The student nodded thoughtfully. That's a pretty good idea. It is. Was he your grandfather? Yes. He looked around the room again. He must have been proud. After he left, I stood alone beside the brass plaque one last time before locking up. For months I had believed Grandpa's greatest gift was naming me successor steward. I finally understood I had been wrong. The title itself wasn't the gift. The gift was the structure he created. He understood something our family didn't realize until much later. No single person should control both purpose and profit. One protects the future, the other keeps the doors open. Both matter. Separating them wasn't a sign of distrust. It was an act of wisdom. Before turning off the lights, I looked around Bay 3 one final time. The benches were covered with fresh sawdust. Safety glasses hung neatly on their hooks. A half-finished walnut jewelry box waited beside a tape measure exactly where one of the students had left it. The room looked alive again. Not because everything had stayed the same, but because it had finally been allowed to become what Grandpa always intended. Caleb's voicemail had arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning asking for my signature. At the time, I thought I had been invited into a fight over property. I couldn't have been more wrong. I had been invited into a promise made years before I even understood it existed. My family sold Grandpa's workshop without telling me. In the end, they still sold it. The buyer still bought it. Money still changed hands. What didn't change was the one thing Grandpa believed should never belong to the highest bidder. Bay 3 was never the most valuable part of the workshop. It was simply the part that reminded everyone why the workshop had been worth building in the first place.